from UC Davis today. Professor Zhao has received her PhD in electrical engineering in 2001 from Cornell University. And since 2004, she has been on the faculty at UC Davis, where she's currently a professor. Along the way, she actually received several prestigious awards, most notably 2010 by Signal Processing Magazine Best Paper Award, as well as 2000 Young Author Best Paper Award from the Signal Processing Society. So with that, I'm going to follow to Zhao.
Thank you. Thanks to Richard for the introduction and for hosting me. And also, I want to thank John for inviting me. And unfortunately, I cannot meet him this time. And I was told he's has to go to Europe this week. So in this talk, we will consider multi-arm bandit problems, a family of adaptive learning problems in dynamic systems with unknown models. And we will first give a brief overview of the classic results, and then we'll consider a few recent results we have. So the multi-arm bandit problem, we will consider first the mathematical abstraction of the problem. It essentially involves multi-arm bandit machine shown here. That's where the name of this family of problems come from. We have a single player who at each given time can choose one of the n arms to play. And if we play one arm, we will receive a random reward drawn from certain distribution. And if we play that arm successively, the reward will be i.i.d over the successive plays. And what we don't know is the reward reward statistics, sigma I. We don't know what is the expectation of the reward we will get at each given time for each arm. And the objective here is, at each given time, based on what we have observed so far, we decide which arm to play. We want to maximize the long-term reward we can get. And the essence of the problem is in the trade-off between exploitation and exploration. So on one hand, we want to fully exploit what we have observed so far by playing the arm that gives us the largest average reward up to now. So the arm with the largest sample. This is an indication of the quality of this arm, how rewarding this arm is. But on the other hand, we also want to explore, to learn. So we may want to play an arm we haven't played many times so far. So in that case, the sample mean may not be an accurate reflection of the true mean. So we should have the consideration of playing an arm for learning its reward statistics so that we can improve our selection in the future. So this is the mathematical abstraction of the problem. It has diverse applications. So the first multi-arm bandit problem was posed by Thompson in 1933. He was a professor at the Department of Pathology at Yale University. So the application he was considering is clinical trial. So if you consider we have patients with certain condition, they arrive at a clinic sequentially. There are two experimental treatments for this condition, and we don't know the effectiveness of these two treatments. So when a patient comes in, we decide to use one treatment, and we observe the recovery of the patient, and then we dynamically decide which treatment we should use for the future patients, and we want to cure as many patients as possible. This essentially is a multi-arm bandit with two arms. And a more recent application that we have considered is in the cognitive radio networks for dynamic spectrum access. So if we have n channels in the spectrum that is allocated to a primary network, who is using this slotted structure. And the secondary user tries to search for the idle slots to maximize its own throughput. And due to limited sensing capability, so at the beginning of each slot, we can only sense a subset, say k, out of the n channels. And again, the selection is a selection problem. Among these n at any given slot, which k channels we should sense. If we take an idle slot, we'll get the unit reward. If it's busy, we get nothing. So this, again, each channel can be considered as an arm, and our reward, if we take a simple model of the channel occupancy, it's just busy idle i.i.d over time. but we don't know the traffic load, that's the mean of the Bernoulli distribution, then how do we do the selection to maximize our throughput? If we take this simple traffic model, then this is a classic Bandit problem. So there are many other applications. We'll just list a few here. One is the web search problem. Say after the seminar, if you're interested in this topic, you want to search related articles on Bandit. So there are thousands of articles that may be relevant. So how do we select, say, the top 5 to put on the first page without really knowing which one the users will consider the most relevant? So again, we can do selections and adjust our selection over time based on the number of clicks. And similarly for internet advertising or investment or dynamic pricing, we end up with similar problems. How do we select which website to post a particular ads, or select which company we want to invest without really knowing how rewarding each one will be, and we learn from number of clicks or our profit in the past to adjust our selection. And in communication networks, or in terms of, for example, queuing or channel scheduling, we may have a large number of queues, small number of servers, and at each given time, we need to decide which queues we want to serve. Again, it's a selection problem. We may not know the underlying model. Or we have a large number of users and a small number of channels. Different users may see different feeding quality over the channels, and we don't know the feeding statistics. How do we schedule users to the small number of channels to maximize the throughput? Similarly, for target tracking, if I want to track a large number of targets with a small number of agents, how do we dynamically allocate these agents to targets to have a good estimate on the locations of all the targets? So these can all be modeled as different variations of the multi-bandit problem. Essentially, it's just a selection problem. There are many choices we may have with unknown reward statistics at each given time. How do we make our selection and adjust our selection through online learning over time? So the formulation of this problem, if we take the non-Bayesian approach, where we will treat the unknown, which is the reward mean of each arm, theta 1 to theta n, as deterministic parameters. So we have this the so-called non-Bayesian formulation. If we treat them as random variable with certain prior distribution, that's the Bayesian formulation. There's another large set of very beautiful results within the Bayesian framework. We also have some recent result that solves open problem, which is a generally open problem, but we give some quite a surprising result for a special case. So in this talk, we're actually focusing on the non-Bayesian framework, where we have no prior statistic model of the unknowns. So we just treat them as unknown deterministic values, theta 1 to theta n, as the mean of each arm. So we know if the model of the system is known to us. If we know theta 1 to theta n, then the optimal action is obvious. We should always play the arm with the largest theta. So I use the superscript 1 here indicating the order, the rank of the theta. So this is the largest theta. If we know the parameters, then we will always play the arm with the largest theta over capital T time. This is the expected reward we will get. So this is exactly, yes.
It's a fixed value and it's
unknown. Yes, exactly. So the thetas are fixed deterministic value, but we don't know. So this is the best we can get. What we need to do is we want to approach this without knowing theta. So by following a particular policy pi, that's what we want to design. So this notation, this v t pi here, is the total reward we can get within time t by following a policy pi. And the performance of this policy is measured by the difference to this best we can get, defined by the known model scenario. And this quantity is called the regret, also called the cost of learning, rather intuitive, because this is the price we pay for not knowing the model and following a particular policy pi. So if we take a closer look at this difference, the regret, we can see it can be expressed in this way. So essentially, every time we are playing the good arm, the best arm, then we don't lose anything. Every time we are spending on the bad arm, all the n-1 arms, that's not the best one, we will incur this much loss on the expectation. Theta 1 minus theta I, theta I is the i's best arm. So this multiplied by the expected time we spend on the i's best arm, summed over all the n-1 arms that are not the best, that would be the regret. So from this we can see if we want to improve our learning ability, or we want to have a policy with small regret, essentially we need to minimize the amount of time we're spending on the bad arms, but without really knowing which one is the bad arm. So the essence of the problem is to spend as little amount of time as possible on the bad arms, but at the same time have an accurate identification of the bad arms. So we have to spend small amount of time on the bad arms, but at the same time we have to spend enough time on the bad arms to know they are actually the bad arms. So the objective here is to minimize the growth rate of the regret with time t. So it's not difficult to see the regret will grow with time, because we can never be absolutely sure a particular arm is the best one, and then we can stop learning, always play that one. So that will not work unless for some trivial examples. So we'll always be making mistakes. The regret will be growing with time t. So what we want is to minimize the growth rate of this regret. And we can see any sublinear regret. If the regret is growing with time t at a sublinear rate, then we can achieve the maximum average reward defined by the best arm, theta 1. This is the best average reward we can get even when we know the model. So this is the best average performance we can get. So if we have a sublinear regret, then you can see if we divide this by t, the regret is the total loss over time t. So if you want to see the average loss per unit time, you divide by this by t, when t goes to infinity, this will go to 0 if the regret is sublinear. So any sublinear regret will give you the best possible average performance. But this regret is a finer performance measure than the average reward, like throughput we're used to, because it also measures how fast we are approaching this maximum average reward. The slower the regret growth rate, the faster we are approaching to this best possible reward. So the question is whether it is possible to have sublinear regret, which means we can achieve the same average reward defined by the known model, and if yes, how do we approach that best possible performance in the fastest way? So the classic result along this line, the first work is by Lyon Robbins in 1985. The first thing they showed is a fundamental limit on the regret. So this is the minimum regret we can have. So it shows that the regret has to grow at logarithmic order with time t. And they also obtained the leading constant in front of log. So this is the best we can hope for. And they also constructed policies to achieve this minimum regret, but only for 4 specific reward distributions. So if our reward follows Gaussian, Bernoulli, Poisson, or Laplacian distributions, then we know what is the optimal policy we should follow to achieve this best regret.
The theta I is very deterministic, right?
Exactly.
So what is the Kovac-Labrador distance between the
This is the Kovac-Labrador distance between the two distributions parameterized by theta. Yes. So because that essentially measures how much we can differentiate these two distributions. Because our observation essentially is from a certain distribution. We're trying to identify distributions here. So the policy first only limited to this 4 distribution, and also the policy can be constructed only when we know the distribution type. So the only thing that's missing that we don't know is the expectation, is the mean. But we have to know the distribution type in order to know how to construct a policy to achieve this minimum regret. So the follow-up work includes Abrawa's work in 1995. So he developed a different type of so-called index policy, and also only for specific distributions. So beyond the 4 that Lyon Robbins considered, they can also handle exponential distribution. Again, we have to know which distribution we're dealing with Only thing missing is the mean, then we can construct a policy.
So theta I is always the mean?
Theta, yeah, the notation is the mean,
So
yes.
that's the parameterization, so you assume that the distribution is parameterized by its mean.
Yes, exactly.
What happens when the distribution is parameterized by something else?
Because mean is the quantity we're interested in. If you have i.i.d, the reward is, expected reward is completely determined by the mean. So if the mean is known, then the problem is trivial. Because you always play the arm with the largest mean.
Take a Gaussian, for example, assume that it has mean 0, parameterized by the variance. And so the mean would, in this case, the mean would be 0, but let's take a case where we get a different parameterization. The mean is computable, it is a function of the parameter, so that's different.
That's equivalent to the mean is unknown, right? Then you parameter other parameters as function of the
Then
mean.
would it come as theta I that we have over there?
Theta I would show up in the mean, right?
No, I understand, but would the formula be theta I minus theta j?
Exactly,
Or
yes.
would it be a function of theta I and a function of theta j?
It should be theta I minus theta j. Because this is the regret. Regret is on the reward, expected
I
reward.
understand, but suppose the reward were a function, or what was had a distribution. It was parameterized by theta, but theta is not the mean. Then it would not be theta I minus theta j, would it be?
Okay, then you're changing my notation here. So I will also, theta is always the mean. So,
Right.
yeah, so you can see you have another unknown parameter, then theta is a function of that.
All right.
But then you still end up, this has to be theta because that's what matters here. Yeah, but I want to point out that all these, for this policy proposed here, all other parameters are assumed known in order to construct the optimal policy. For example, if it's Gaussian, you have to know the variance. Yeah. So more general, maybe we can see more general policy is a work by Aura in 2002. So they construct a policy that works for any distributions with finite support. So the distribution that takes value within a certain finite interval. And if you know the support or upper bound on the finite support, then you can construct this policy without knowing which specific distribution you are dealing with. So here, we don't have to know the distribution. We only need to know it has finite support and you have upper bound on the finite support. Then you can have this policy and it can achieve log. But it's only order optimal. That means it achieves the log regret order, but may not be the best leading constant. So just give some idea on how the actually the policies work here, so that we can see more about the essence of the problem. So essentially, all these policies are built upon these two key statistics. One is the sample mean, so at each given time t, the sample mean of each arm. So that's just the average reward we have obtained so far from each arm I. This essentially indicates how we should exploit these n arms. And the other is the number of plays, tau it of arm I up to time t. So intuitively, we want to favor the arm with the largest sample mean, and also we want to favor the arm with the smallest number of plays. Because that's the arm we don't really know well enough. Its sample mean may not be accurate, may not be a good indication of how good it is. So then the question here is, how do we combine these two statistics together in terms of selecting arms? So for example, Aura's policy, the so-called UCB policy, combines these two statistics in this specific form. So we have the first term, that's the sample mean of arm I. The second term essentially is given by the number of plays of arm I up to time t. So these two is combined in this specific way. You can compute the index of every arm at any given time t, then you always play the arm that has the largest index. And this index form is actually relatively intuitive given the Lyon-Robbins result on this fundamental limit. So this fundamental limit tells us we have to spend on the log t order of amount of time on every arm in order to have an accurate sense of which arm is the best. So we know we have to spend the log t amount of time, at least, on every arm. So that's what the second term is doing. So you can see if the number of plays on arm I is not growing at the same order as log t, which is in the numerator, the second term will blow up. The index will become really large. That will force us to play that arm because we're selecting the arm with the largest index to play. So this essentially forces the number of plays on every arm should grow at the order of log t at least. So this is essentially the basic idea in the classic policies we have mentioned. Other policies have a similar idea. And one feature of these classic policies is they all have a fixed form of combining these two statistics in arm selection, and which is difficult to adapt when we change the model of the problem. So as we have explained, the model that has been considered in the classic result has the following requirements. So first, the classic policies requires the reward distribution to have either finite support, or if it has infinite support, only works for those specific cases like Gaussian, exponential, Laplacian, etc. And also, the classic results considers only a single player, and which is equivalent to centralized multiple players. If you have multiple players, but they all work together, they share each other's observation, and then they decide jointly who should play which arm, then that's the same problem as a single player problem. And also in terms of the reward, it's either i.i.d. reward over successive plays, so the system has no memory, or it's a so-called rested Markov reward, which means when you play that arm successively, the reward transients according to a Markov chain with unknown transition probability. But when you are not playing this arm, you go play another arm, the state of that arm will frozen. It will wait for you until you come back. So in that case, the problem is, in essence, very similar to the i.i.d. scenario. This is actually the extension done by Venkat and Nelson by following Land-Robbins result. So what we have been doing is we try to eliminate these limitations in the model of the problem. We hope to create results that can broaden the potential applications of Modigliani Bandit. So we are looking for policies with a more flexible structure, have a tunable parameter so that we can handle a more general model. So we want to handle a more general class of reward distributions that may not have finite support and may have any arbitrary infinite support and arbitrary distribution that may have a heavy tail, which we know heavy tail often imposes difficulty in learning the mean, because the probability are not necessarily concentrated around the expectation. And we also want to be able to handle the decentralized scenario where we have multiple players and they're distributed, they cannot share information, they cannot coordinate the selection of the arms, and if they select the same arm, they will collide with each other. None of them get any reward, like in communication scenario, if more than one user go to the same channel. And we also want to handle the so-called restless Markov reward model, which means the reward state of each arm is changing in a Markov way, that's the memory, and even when you're not playing it, the state will still continually evolving according to potentially arbitrary random process. And we don't know the model of the dynamics. So we want to see whether we can extend the classic result to handle these more general models. So we will consider this one by one. Let's first consider how we extend the classic policies. I'll propose a new policy that can handle a general class of reward distributions.
Question?
Yes?
Can you actually generalize the last item to any organic reward process?
That's a very good question, but so far we don't have that result. So when you play the arm, when the arm is being actively played, it has to be a Markov because we need a certain mixing properties of the Markov process to find the solution. But when you are not playing it, a state can drift in any random process. It doesn't even have to be about it. So that's something we can handle. We will see that later. But if you have general, even when you play it's a general algorithmic process, we don't know. So let's first consider general reward distribution. So we actually propose, in certain way, a very different policy compared to the classic policy, which always combine the two statistics just mentioned together in arm selection. So it's a very intuitive policy with a very simple structure. So we call it the determinate sequencing of exploration and exploitation, short ESE. So the basic idea here is we will partition the total time into two sequences. One we call the exploration sequence. The rest of the time will belong to the exploitation sequence. So illustrated here, the red bars here are time instants belong to the exploration sequence. So in the exploration sequence, the player would play all arms in a round-robin fashion. So if this is the exploration sequence, if we have 3 arms, I will play arm 1. When this comes, I play arm 2, this arm 3, then I go back 1, 2, 3 again. Then, so in the exploration sequence, I know exactly which arms I should be playing. I'm playing them in a round-robin fashion, completely for the purpose of learning everyone's reward statistics. And then in the rest of the blue times, at each given blue time, I will play the arm with the largest sample mean, computed from observation I obtained so far, including both exploration and exploitation time. So that's the simple structure of the problem. So in this case, you can see the two statistics, how many times we have played the arm and the sample mean are in certain ways separated when we select arms. So in the exploration, we're just learning. We play all the arms one by one. In exploitation, we only look at the sample mean. We play the arm with the largest sample mean. So the trade-off between exploration and exploitation is reflected in the cardinality of the exploration sequence. So within a total amount of time, what is the amount of time which is dedicated to the exploration sequence for learning? So this is a tunable parameter I'm talking about. So the structure is very simple. We only now need to design this cardinality of the exploration sequence. And this design can be adjusted according to how difficult the underlying model is for us to learn. So that's the essence of the policy. So let's see how should we choose this cardinality of the exploration sequence. What is involved here? So first we can see the cardinality of the exploration sequence defines a lower bound of the regret order we can get. So let's consider we can choose a log order of the cardinality for exploration sequence. Then it's like this. So the learning is really sparse. It comes at log T order. Or we can choose a denser sequence, square root T. Then you can see there's much more learning time instance. So which one we should choose? So if we choose square root T, then our regret cannot be better than square root T. That's clear because among these square root T time, we are spending a fixed fraction of them, that's n minus 1 over n fraction of them on bad arms, because I'm playing all the arms one by one. So I cannot hope for a regret order that's better than my cardinality of exploration sequence. So I want to make this cardinality as low as possible, but it cannot be arbitrarily low, because if this is too low, then when in the exploitation sequence, I'm picking the one with the largest sample mean, that could be wrong. So then I will incur regrets during the exploitation sequence, which is larger than the cardinality of exploration. Then the total regret will be dominated by the mistake in the exploitation sequence. So what I want is the minimum x for the cardinality, so that the regret in the exploitation sequence, or mistakes I'm making in the exploitation sequence using sample mean, is no larger than x. Then my regret will be given by this x. So that's the x we are looking for. And the result is the following. So first, if the distributions, so here we don't need to know what distribution types we are dealing with. We don't have to know whether it's Gaussian or Laplacian. We only need to know the moment generating function if the moment generating function of the distribution satisfies certain conditions. It's actually a very mild condition. So we just need the moment generating function of this is a reward random variable, is properly bounded by an exponential function around the 0, only around the 0. Within around the 0, any arbitrary positive length of interval around the 0. So if this is the case, then we can achieve the optimal log regret. So we can choose a cardinality for the exploration sequence equal to log and achieve regret equal to log, which according to Robin's result, that is the fundamental limit. That's the best order we can hope for. So just here I draw some examples to see how general this condition is. What's the class of reward distribution we can handle to achieve log using our policy. So all the reward distribution that can be handled in the classical policies, we can handle. All satisfy these conditions.
So theta here is still the mean.
Theta is still the mean.
This has to be true for every I.
Yes. So the distribution of every I should be bounded, but they don't have to be bounded by the same exponential form. Yes. So for example, Gaussian definitely will satisfy because this exponential bound here is exactly the moment generating function of Gaussian distribution with a particular z. But we don't need this to be bounded for all u. So only around the 0. So this is more general than sub-Gaussian. If this is true for all u, then this class of distribution is called sub-Gaussian. But we don't need the moment generating function can even be infinite, may not exist after this finite interval around 0. So every Gaussian definitely satisfy, and exponential Laplacian, Poisson, all these will satisfy. Of course, any distribution with finite support will satisfy this for sure. They are actually sub-Gaussian, which is more restricted. And there are other, you can come up with many examples that the classic policy cannot handle. I just draw one, which is a chi-square distribution. So now if we have even, there are still distribution that doesn't satisfy this condition. That would be heavy-tail distribution. Heavy-tail distribution doesn't have a moment generating function except exactly at 0. So any value non-zero, they will blow up to infinity. So in that case, clearly it doesn't satisfy this. So then in this case, we also have results. So we can choose, we have to choose exploration sequence with a larger cardinality, larger than log. Now these are also intuitive. When you have heavy tail distribution, that means your probabilities are not really concentrated around this expectation. Then learning the mean based on sample means is much harder. So you need more samples in order to have accurate convergence of sample into the true mean. So what?
So that you had by laying Robbins, you said that there were optimal policies available in particular cases.
Yes.
But was the result true only for these cases? And if not, what were the conditions under which laying Robbins?
You mean the policy?
No.
The lower bound.
No, the actual asymptotics for the regret.
That's the lower bound of the regret. I think that only has some regularity conditions. For example, the total range of unknown theta has some continuity and all that, but not on the reward distribution.
No conditions on the distribution?
That's how I remembered. I can double check on the details.
Then how does that join with what we have here?
That's only a lower bound. It doesn't mean it's achievable. That shows the minimum has to be log. Then they construct a policy to achieve that for specific distribution. So what we show here is we can achieve that lower bound for a more general class of reward distribution. So then if you have heavy tail, what we can have is, suppose the heavy tail is essentially the following. The moments of the distribution exist only up to the p order. Higher than p, they're all infinity. So then in this case, we have to choose a cardinality with order of t raised to 1 over p, and then we can show we can achieve this regret order. So this is still, in general, a sublinear regret rate for any p that is greater than 1. So sublinear regret, as we said, you can always achieve the best possible average performance defined by the non-Markov. So what is missing here for heavy tail is we don't know whether this is the best one can do. Because like Robin said, the best you can do is log. So in this scenario, we can achieve that. For heavy tail, you cannot achieve that, but we don't know whether it's just fundamentally you cannot achieve it or our policy is not there yet. So that's what is missing here.
How do I interpret this if the mean doesn't exist?
If the mean doesn't exist, then the problem is not well imposed. Because one play of the arm, you get infinite reward. How do I compare which
Well,
one
that's
is
the
good?
limitation of the formulation.
Well, yeah, because if mean is infinite, you shouldn't be looking at the expected reward, right? Because there is no way to compare. One play, you get infinite.
Change the formulation and look
Yeah,
at
you may need a completely different formulation. Instead of looking at the expected reward, you probably want to look at the other metrics. Yeah. So So the only condition we need here is the mean exists. And we don't have to know what distribution we're dealing with. So we don't need to know distribution type, the policy would work. So I will skip, in the interest of time, I will skip the details on how we observe this, how we obtain this result. If you're interested, we can talk about that after the talk. So the next thing we mentioned, we want to extend, or we want to generalize the formulation, is to consider decentralized scenario, where we have multiple players. And this is easy to motivate because in communication system, we often have to deal with a network of distributed users. If we consider again the dynamic spectrum sensing problem, so now n channels, each one can be treated as arm, but we have m distributed secondary users who are all searching for the idle slots. And they cannot exchange information with each other. And if more than one user goes to the same channel, if that's playing the same arm, then they will collide, no one receive any. Or if you have pair sensing, only one of them receive reward, other receive nothing, which is still undesirable because if you orthogonalize them over different channels at the system level, network level, you could get more throughput. So the general formulation of the problem is the following. We have M, which is smaller than the number of arms, distributed players. Each player chooses one arm to play at any given time. Players can only make decisions based on their own local observation. You don't know what other players are doing. You don't know their observations. And if multiple players choose the same arm they like, they receive no reward, or each one receives some partial reward. And the collisions, in a general model, collisions may or may not be observable. That means you play a particular arm, you get a reward equal to 5. You don't know whether this is the full reward offered by the arm, or you only got partial reward because you collided with someone else. So in this case, the problem becomes really challenging in the sense that collision not only affects your immediate reward, it also affects your learning ability. So if I receive 5, how do I know whether it truly reflects how good this arm is or not? Or it's just because this is a really good arm, it could have offered 100 to me, but just because I collided with other player, I only receive 5. So when collision is unobservable, I really have to decide which data are the clean data that I can learn about the reward statistics, which are not. So that's one challenge we may have to deal with. We will see that more later. So again, the performance is similar. We consider regret, which is compared to the best possible scenario you can come up with. That will be known theta, known parameters, and the centralized scheduling. So all the players can be centralized scheduled, no collision will happen. Then in this case, every player would be orthogonalized over the best m possible arms. The total reward we can get is t multiplied by the sum of the largest m thetas. So then, without knowing the model, without centralized scheduling, our performance following policy pi is given by this difference. And we want to minimize the regret growth rate. And again, if we can have a sublinear regret, then we can achieve this best possible average performance, sum of all the m largest thetas. That's the best we can get under this most idealistic scenario. So challenging, as we have mentioned, if collisions are not observable, it affects not only immediate reward, but also our learning ability, which is really a more profound effect. And the other difficulty is here, each player may have to learn not only the best arm, but also the second best arm up to the m best arm. Because if you want to do efficient sharing, we have to, at least some of us has to be play the second best arm. We shouldn't all go to play the best arm at the client. So we have to identify not just the best arm, but potential second best up to the m best arm. So you may wonder why is that difficult. If I can know best arm was from his second best arm. So this actually is not a trivial extension. If you want to identify, say, the second best arm, then the classic result we just mentioned won't work, won't give you that. So for example, the UCB policy we mentioned, we compute the index, we always play the arm with the largest index. That's when we want the best arm. So now if you want the second best arm, what do? You play the arm with the second largest index. That's one way to do it. But that won't work. Why is that? Because the second best arm, let's say that's the arm that you haven't played long enough. So its true mean actually is very large, right? So then it has largest index, then you won't play it. That's actually the arm you want. You're not playing it. When you're not playing it, this tau I is not growing at log t. The second term becomes even larger. Then you are not playing it because you want the second best. So that won't work. So the classic result can actually not easily be extended if you want an arm that's not the best. You want a particular rank. And but the policy we just described can actually, because we have this round robin of learning every arm, and we can actually learn the rank, every rank, with accuracy. So you can just, in the exploitation sequence, if you want the second best arm, you choose the second largest sample. As simple as that. Everything is the same. And we can also have time varying objective. For example, some user at this time, they may be more important. You want them to play the best arm, but as time goes, you may want them to play the second best. You can even change this without any difference. You just change which sample mean you are choosing.
In all this, you have to kind of assume that the sample algorithm that you see is converting to the right balance. Right?
Yes, that's essentially when we show the regret is log, we have to show that.
But
Yes.
is it cognitive already enough to give different guys are trying to get on different types of subchannels? How do you choose that? Right? Because they are interacting with each other. Right?
So that is the question, you mean different secondary user, right?
Right.
It is possible, the question is when you collide whether you see the state of the channel as i.i.d or not.
But not only that, they will also react with the other.
You mean the primary user?
No, other secondary user.
No, we are designing the policy for secondary.
So you're assuming there's only one secondary user?
No, this is the distributed setting, there will be multiple secondary.
Right, so.
But we are designing decentralized policy for each one. So each secondary user will be following a specific policy.
Right.
Yes.
So.
I can design how they react to each other. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Because the problem is the design problem. I want to design what is the policy for each player so that I can maximize the total system level.
One of the secondary users is not using the same policy. Can you still guarantee that this thing goes away?
That will be a different, it's like you have a malicious user who are not doing what they're
No,
supposed
not
to do.
necessarily malicious, but simply using different policy.
You can, actually, in a different setting, which is a different framework, earlier result we have, different players can use different single player policy. But we have a structure of combining them together in a distributed way, and you can actually achieve log. But today I'm talking about different ones that using DSE. So everyone is using the DSE structure.
So will it create some kind of like the tragedy of the commons? Like if it's the best one, but everybody says it, this arm is best, and everybody take this arm to get the reward.
That's
Finally,
precisely what we want to avoid when you design the policy. That's why every user may have to identify not just the best one. You have to identify the top M arms and then learn how to share with each other of the top M arms. Not everyone just identify the best one, go there. So we are designing the decentralized policy to have efficient learning and efficient share. So the basic policy is, again, we consider the DSE structure because what we are happy here with is this simple structure is very easily extendable to different scenarios, similarly handling multiple players. So again, we have this structure of exploration sequence and exploitation sequence. So in this case, in the exploration sequence, every player would play all arms in a round robin fashion, like in a single player case, but with a different offset. Very trivial. I'm playing arm 1, 2, 3, you play 2, 3, 1, so we don't climb. And in the exploitation sequence, each of us will play the top M arms in a round robin fashion with different offset. So we pick the top M in terms of samples. So in this case, collision will happen because our top M may not be the same. You observe different sample mean. I have a different sample mean. There's a random variable. So even though we have different offset, collisions may happen. But that we can show it won't affect the regret order. So what we have shown here is you can achieve the same regret order as in the centralized single player case. You can still achieve log regret. That's the best one can get even in a centralized scenario. And also you can see for this structure, something is needed. That's the pre-agreement among players. So we have to, first, we all have a common exploration sequence. We all know when we should explore, when we should exploit. And then we also have agreement on the offset. I'm playing offset 0, 1, 2, 3. You're playing offset 1, 2, 3, 1, right? So this result can actually be extended without any pre-agreement under the condition that collisions are observable. So when I collide, I know I collide. So the effect is only on my immediate reward. I want to avoid collision. So in this case, each player can actually have your own exploration sequence. We don't have to be synchronized to learn. And we don't have to have a pre-agreement on the offsets. You just pick a particular offset of rotating among all the channels, either all N or all M for the exploitation sequence. So what happens is why we require collision to be observable, because we have to learn from collision about when I should adjust my offset. So whenever a collision occurs, I observe that. Then I will randomly select a different offset. So in this case, we can ensure over majority of time, except log t, we are orthogonized over different offsets. So when collisions are not observable, then the problem is very difficult because I have no clue when I receive a 5 whether I'm colliding with someone. That means I may have to readjust my offset or not. So in that case, we require this pre-agreement. So when a collision observable, then we can have, without any agreement among players, completely asynchronous, we can achieve log regret, which is the best possible scenario. So this, we're happy because, again, it's the same structure, simple structure of the policy, but can handle distributed scenario. As we mentioned, the classic policy cannot even handle single player when you want the second best arm, cannot easily be adjusted. And the last one we want to talk about is the restless reward model. So far we have been focusing on the i.i.d. scenario. You can actually put all these together, you can have multiple players with restless model and the general reward distribution. So in the restless scenario, so the problem will be now the following. So when we play a particular arm consecutively, then the reward will come from a Markov chain, but we require to define a state for now, with unknown transition matrix, pi. I is the index of arm. When the arm is passive, when we're not playing, then this arm state can evolve according to any arbitrary unknown random process, orthogonal or not. So this is the problem we want to solve. So now, let's first consider single player, how this player should select arms to get a good reward. Again, the measure we want to be something like regret. We want to compare how far we are from the ideal scenario where you know everything. So this problem is very difficult in the sense that even when you know the model, when you know the transition probabilities, and even when you are passive, the arm is also Markoving, and you know that transition probability as well. Even in that case, the problem is intractable. It has been shown to be piece-space hard by Mitchell and Siskers. So even when we know the model, even when everything is Markoving, we don't know what we should do. What is the optimal thing to do? The reason really here is optimal policy when we know the Markoving model is no longer staying on one arm. So previously, when you have i.i.d. or rested Markov reward, there is a specific arm that is the best. You should always stay on that one when you know the model. So then, when we don't know the model, what we are learning is only one of the n possibilities, right? So here, the optimal policy is no longer staying on one arm. The optimal policy is optimal way of switching among the n arms based on the past observations. And even finding that is piece-space hard. So even if we can find that, the learning part will be extremely hard because there are infinite possibilities of switching among the n arms based on past observations, and we have to figure out which one is the best depending on the unknown transition probabilities we have. So this problem in general is intractable. The known model is in general intractable already. So we lowered our standard. We consider a weaker definition of the regret. So we are comparing with the case of the optimal single arm policy and the known model. That means if you know the models and you are restricting yourself to playing only one arm all the time. So then there is one particular arm that will be the best when you always play it. So that's the one we wanted to approach. So in that case, when we know the model, we will be always playing an arm who will give us the maximum average reward theta 1 that is determined by the stationary distribution of the transition matrix. So then this is total reward we can get. And we don't know which arm is the best because we don't know the transition probability. This is the reward we can get. And we want to minimize this regret. And this constant term here is only taking account of the transient effect of the best arm, which may not start with the stationary distribution. So the total reward may be a constant value higher than this T minus.
Is there a bound for that?
Yes, you can easily get a bound, but of course it depends on the transition probability. But anyway, this is a constant that doesn't grow with time T. So if you are interested in the regret order, then this term definitely won't show up. It won't even affect the leading constant of the order. Now this is just a constant added on top of it. So in this case, the problem seems to be more similar to the i.i.d. scenario because again, we try to identify which arm is the best. We want to spend most of the time on that best arm. But still there are two major differences compared to the i.i.d. scenario. So first, because the rewards are transient in a Markov way, and when we leave that arm, the state may wander away. So then we have to play an arm for a consecutive amount of time in order to see the behavior of the Markov chain. So that's one thing. We cannot just play once and go somewhere else. And second, whenever we leave, we come back, the state has changed. Then what we are seeing are segments of the sample path, non-contiguous sample path. So each time we come back, there may be a transient behavior. You will never see the steady state always if it's a finite amount of time. So in this case, we have to limit our arm switching to bound the transient effect. We cannot be switching out of the best arm linear amount of time, then your regret cannot be bounded by something. Because every time you come back, you will potentially suffer a transient effect. So then the policy we propose as a structure can again be extended to handle this scenario. So essentially here, we introduce an epoch structure. So now, in terms of exploration, we don't just choose independent time instance as the subsequence. Every time we choose, we actually choose an epoch of consecutive slots, time instance. And the epoch length, the rest of the exploitation is also epoch structure. So in an example shown here, the blue ones are the exploitation epoch. During this time, I'm staying on the best arm with the largest sample mean, always there. And in the exploration sequence, when I'm learning, I'm partitioning the total epoch into 3 epochs. So I spend on each of the arms for a contiguous amount of time, if I have 3 arms. So then, again, the design here is what is the fraction, the cardinality of the exploration, except they all come in batches. You have this epoch structure. The other thing we have is the epoch lengths are growing exponentially or geometrical. So in this case, we can limit arm switching to the log order. Then the transient effect can be bounded by log. So all these adds up, we can achieve the log regret, as in the i.i.d. scenario. But of course, as we mentioned, we've lowered our standard. We're not really comparing with the best possible thing you can do when you know the model, which is not staying on the best one, but switching to explore the transient states of other arms.
So this means that the regret could actually be a negative number. as you give the suboptimal standard.
It is possible
and
under
you
certain
minus
scenarios. Yes, yes. So for the strict case, if we solve our high standard, we try to approach the best possible one can do under known model. As we said, even that is an intractable problem in general. We do have some results, but only for a special case. So that's motivated by the dynamic spectrum access problem we mentioned earlier. Again, we have these n channels. Let's consider a single player. We want to find the idle slots. So the reward is just Bernoulli, easy idle. Oh, sorry, not Bernoulli. We now extend this to the Markov model. So each channel is transiting according to this Markov chain, but we don't know the transition period. So that's the same problem we had earlier, but now in this case, we can actually approach the best possible performance when you are not restricting yourself on the sensing the same channel. So the reason we can do this is for this special scenario with only two-stage Markov chain, the policy, optimal policy under known model, actually we have an earlier result. We show this can be solved. So in general, if you have general Markov chain, it's an intractable problem. It's an open problem since 1980s. But for this special case, we have nice result, which is earlier work with collaborators at USC and the University of Michigan. So what we showed, essentially, the optimal policy has a semi-universal structure. So in general, optimal policy can be any arbitrary function of switching among the n channels. But we show that the optimal policy only takes one of the two possible forms. When the P11 is greater than P01, that's our transition probability. P11 is here, P01 is here. When this is true, and since we know the model, so we know when this will happen, then our optimal policy is the following. If the current channel we sense is idle, we stay with it. We will sense that channel again. Until it becomes busy, then we switch. Which channel do we switch to? We switch to the channel we visited longest time ago. So that's the optimal thing to do. In the other scenario, if our P11 is smaller than P01, then we sort of do the other way. If the current channel we sense is busy, we didn't get any reward, we actually sense it again. Until it becomes idle, we get the reward, then we switch. And which channel do we switch to? We first look at all the channels we visited even number of slots ago. If there are such channels, we pick the one we visited most recently. If no such channels, we pick the channel we visited longest time. So that's what it is. The good thing here is, if we know this, then we know when we don't know P11, P01, we don't know which one is true, but we are only learning from these two possibilities. We know we should either do this way or we should do this way. That's what the structure of the optimal policy under known model can help us when we don't know the model, because it limits all the possibilities we have to learn. Originally, if you know nothing, which that's in general the case, the problem is intractable if you know the model, then there's infinite possibility we don't even know how to learn, where to start, where to test. Here we know it can only be one of these two, then we can learn based on that.
Insert the equivalence.
The equivalence of,
Insert the equivalence.
I'm not sure I'm getting
You're going to try to figure out in which one of the two cases you are. You're going to do this by either directly or indirectly listing these possibilities.
not necessarily. We're not really asking P and then see which one is forcing to.
No, but you indirectly, that's what you end up doing.
Certainly, I'm trying to learn which of these is the best one. So the way to formulate this is just treat this as a two-arm bandit problem. So what is the arm in a bandit? It's just one of the possible options you have. I know my optimal option is within these two. I treat each one as an arm. Now I want to figure out which arm is the best. So that's the hypothetical multi-arm bandit we have. Treat each way of channel switching as an arm, not a specific channel as an arm now. So then we learn which one is the best one. That's essentially the problem. Conceptually, you can do this, but what is the catch here? Is if arm now is a strategy of switching among n channels, if I want to play this arm, how long should I follow this strategy? If I cannot follow it forever, then this may not be the best arm, right? So I have to decide how long I should follow this strategy, which is switching among the n channels, then see how good it is, and then may try a different one. So it turns out the optimal length of following this strategy, unfortunately, depends on the transition profit, which we don't know. So this is something we have to handle. And the other, again, the reward are not i.i.d. in time, is not even i.i.d. across these two arms. Because these two arms are switching over the same set of n channels. So the reward you get by switching these two strategies will be correlated over time. So we have to handle these two. And the way to handle the first one is, instead of prefix the number of slots you should follow each strategy, we actually let it grow with time, but at any arbitrary slow rate. And the sacrifice we get here is we cannot achieve exactly log. We can achieve something arbitrarily close to log. So what's in front of log is no longer constant, but also a growing sequence with t. But this growing sequence can be arbitrarily slow. Whatever you want, you specify how close you want to get to log, then based on this, I can design how my length of following each strategy should be. And in terms of handling the non-i.i.d. scenario, especially cross arms, we actually have a modified Shannon-Hopkins bound to show how the sample mean deviates from the true mean. So that's the basic idea of the talk. I will just conclude and acknowledge my students. So we are essentially trying to broaden the model of the classic Bandit problem and hopefully make this class, this mathematical model more applicable. And what we look at is we want policies that can handle a more general class of reward distributions and without knowing the distribution type, and computationally handle heavy tail distribution. And the policy we propose can also be used for decentralized scenario with multiple distributed players, and it can also handle the restless Markov model. And this work, joint work with two of my students, Kevin Liu and Haoyang Liu. And the work on the last part I just mentioned is also joint work with Professor Krishna Machari at USC. And that's all. I think we can.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, but I think there's a roundtable discussion.
Yeah, so there is another roundtable discussion at 2:30 in maybe audience 2160 years, the ISR conference room. So you can hold on to our questions with them. Thank you.